Can you tell us what your new portfolio will be as of today?
I'll leave that up, David, to Labor leader Anthony Albanese to announce that later today. But I'm wanting to make a contribution. I think we've got to rebuild in Queensland, reconnect with Queenslanders, and as you say, 1 in 4 Queenslanders voted for Labor, so we've got to do much better in my home state.
Does that mean taking on a role that is going to connect with Queenslanders, whether it's resources or perhaps North Queensland focus?
Well, I'll leave that up to Anthony to announce that later, but I certainly want to play a considerable role in terms of reconnecting with Queenslanders in places where there was big swings. It's not just in my home city of Ipswich, but in Gladstone and Rockhampton and Townsville and elsewhere, where Labor suffered badly in Queensland. We just can't think that we can win government when we're giving away 20 seats to the LNP. It's a reminder that Queensland is the 3rd biggest state in terms of population. The number of seats we have in federal parliament in Queensland, for example, is almost equivalent to Tasmania, South Australia and West Australia combined. It's a great reminder to us that we've got to do better in Queensland if we think we can win government.
To those areas you mentioned, Gladstone, Rockhampton and so on, the Adani coal mine played a pretty big issue during the election campaign. What is your view? If it does pass its final hurdle, its final approval, will it be a good thing for the Adani mine to go ahead?
If it brings jobs to Queenslanders, of course it's a good thing, and I welcome the Queensland government's initiative and finally taking steps. The procrastination, the equivocation for a long time afflicted us in Queensland federally, and can I just say that Queenslanders are both pro-mining as well as pro the environment. You can't be against mining in central and north Queensland and think you can win seats.
You talk about the equivocation that hurt Labor in its federal campaign. Do you agree part of that equivocation was on the part of federal Labor? There's not been such a clear position on Adani.
It was a challenge for us, and we had a couple of candidates. Let me give you an illustration of the challenges we faced, David. We had a coal miner up there in Russell Robertson in Capricornia. We ended up with 1 in 5 people voting for Labor in that seat. We had a candidate, Zach Beers, a union organiser who represented people in the mining sector. These are men who worked at the coalface and working in these mining sectors. Yet still we got drubbed in these seats. I mean, these are great candidates, but Labor's message wasn't getting through. Queenslanders weren't listening to us, and we need to do better and need to have a more clear approach in relation to Queensland, and particularly central and north Queensland and the mining sector. And I welcome the Queensland government taking steps. It looks like the Adani Carmichael mine is likely to go through. It looks like there's only a couple of steps to go, and I welcome that.
Because you are being clearer here than even Anthony Albanese, to be fair. So just to underline that, you are saying the Adani mine, which will bring jobs, is a good thing for Queensland.
Well, if it brings jobs to Queensland, of course it's good. There's a couple of steps to go. The Queensland government's looking like it's taking through a process that involves getting advice from Geoscience Australia, from CSIRO. There's a groundwater management plan that they're working with Adani in relation to. My understanding is that they're going to that process will be completed in June sometime. And if jobs arise from this, and if the proposal of Adani stacks up, if the environmental concerns are addressed by the Queensland government, if that's the case, then it brings jobs in Queensland. Of course it's good for Queensland if there's jobs and if there's economic development and financial security to central and north Queenslanders.
And does that extend, Shayne Neumann, more broadly to more coal mining in Queensland or elsewhere? If it brings jobs, more coal mining is a good thing.
The Queensland government's approved a number of mining projects during the time that Adani's been considered. I mean, you can't be against mining in Queensland and think you can win seats in Queensland. Let me just say this. People have asked me questions in relation to the Great Barrier Reef as well and the impact on that. The Great Barrier Reef, David, employs about 64,000 people. There's about $5.6 billion annual contribution to the national economy, and it's worth about $56 billion to the Australian wealth. It's important, and Queenslanders value the Great Barrier Reef, but you've got to do mining environmentally soundly And that's why I welcome the Queensland Government working with Adani on environmental management, groundwater management issues to make sure that any mining that takes place in Central and North Queensland is done in an environmentally satisfactory and safe way.
But this is the point. As long as that's done in an environmentally satisfactory way, you are happy with the Galilee Basin being opened up, more coal mining happening if it is going to generate jobs?
Well, I'm happy for mining generally to take place, can I just say, in Queensland. I mean, this underpins the royalties from mining.
Is the divisive issue within Labor, because some oppose any new coal mining, but you're saying very clearly here, as long as it creates jobs, you have no problem.
As long as these things are done in an environmentally safe way, and long as it stacks up environmentally, commercially, and I've said all along, and Labor's said all along, there shouldn't be any federal government funding towards it. I mean, the approvals have taken place in relation to from the federal point of view. There's a sovereign risk argument as well that we've always said that we wouldn't prejudice sovereign risk in terms of mining generally. You've got to be supportive of the mining industry in Queensland if you want to win seats and listen to the voice of Queenslanders in Central and North Queensland. And that penetrates across all of Queensland. Royalties underpin the Queensland government budget, and they will when the budget's announced very shortly. So it's important. It's not just in mining, it's tourism, it's service industries, it's primary production. These things are important. Queensland's very different to any other state in relation to it. Brisbane doesn't dominate. It's a very decentralised state, and you've got to listen to the voice of regional Queenslanders if we want to win seats here in Queensland.
Look, Labor did argue for a much higher emissions reduction target at this election, 45%. How do you think that went down in Queensland, particularly those regions you're talking about?
I don't think Queenslanders are any lacking in terms of their affection and desire to protect their environment than any other state. Queenslanders put solar panels on their roof. They love the Great Barrier Reef. They recycle. They want to care for their rivers and streams. They want to make sure our environment's good. I think there's a false dichotomy and a false binary choice here. I think you can be both pro-mining as well as pro-environment.
As a threat to coal mining jobs in Central and North Queensland?
Well, no one raised with me directly at the polling booths and my campaigning in relation to these issues. I might add, it's going to be very challenging for us in relation to the 45% target if the current government pursues their direct action policies, which is basically, as Malcolm Turnbull said, a fig leaf of a policy, and we've seen emissions continuing to rise. We've got to take steps in relation to addressing anthropogenic climate change. We've got to make sure that we take steps, and that's why Labor took a strong policy in relation to this. The trouble was that we focused a lot on the cost without actually explaining to Queenslanders the benefit of the renewable energy industry and what jobs can flow from it much better.
But to your point there, that it may be harder, in 3 years' time when you go to the next election, to continue pursuing a 45% target if we're 3 years down the track under the government's direct action plan?
Well, we will. I mean, this government, emissions are going up under this government, and it's going to be much more challenging. But this government should be listening to the voices of those people who are saying we've got to take action on climate change. This is a real problem. They've got to listen to the scientists, and we've got to take action and meet the targets that are necessary for us to do our bit internationally as well as locally.
More broadly on the election result, do you agree with Bill Shorten that corporate leviathans and a financial behemoth were to blame for Labor's loss? Well,
I'll give you a couple of illustrations. I'm not alone in looking at my local newspaper. My local newspaper, a daily, is the Queensland Times. Day after day after day, there was the Palmer Party having full-page ads in that paper. I drove with Zach Beers, the Labor candidate for Flynn, after doing a round table with workers in Gladstone, up to Rockhampton, where I did a press conference, stand-up press conference. As I drove up there, billboard after billboard after billboard was there, not just attacking us from the Conservative parties, but actually attacking us from United Australia Party. Clive Palmer spent a fortune on billboards, and you constantly got that message. So, Anthony Albanese has said there were vested interests as well, and I agree with Anthony and I agree with Bill. There were issues in relation. There were very strong issues in relation to this, and Clive Palmer spent a fortune in terms of that. It looks like he spent as much during the campaign as both the Labor Party and National Party and Liberal parties combined.
But you do seem to acknowledge Labor's policy and messaging was also part of the issue here. We know Anthony Albanese's already touched on the franking credits policy. How did that play in Queensland? And would you shed any tears if it were dropped altogether?
Well, you're right. There are issues in terms of messaging, policy and campaign capacity and infrastructure that we need to improve here in Queensland. The franking credits and other tax agenda items, I think people found difficult to understand. They were complex. I got that repeatedly. It wasn't just the 4% of people who actually were affected. It was their children and grandchildren who raised those issues with me. So that's a policy we will review and consider, like all our other policies going forward. We'll have to address issues in relation to the taxation base and how we get revenue if we want to deliver services, better schools and improve hospital care. But we've got to look at all those issues, and there are always things that we need to look at in terms of tax loopholes and other issues in relation to how we raise revenue. But this was an issue that affected us significantly, and it was raised with me not just in terms of middle and upper class Australians, but also aspirational working class people. Look, David, I'm the son of a cleaner in the meatworks and a shop assistant. My parents aspired for a better life for me. And people in working class families around Ipswich and the Somerset region and around regional Queensland aspire for a better life for their kids. And if they feel there's things in terms of government policy which may hold them back or impact on that or provide a barrier, they are concerned about it, and they voted accordingly a couple of weekends ago.
Can I just finally turn to your role over the last 3 years? You've been the Shadow Immigration Minister. You clearly weren't encouraged to do a lot in terms of media appearances during that time. Do you think in hindsight that was the right approach?
Well, David, I did precisely what I was asked to do. There were times when I didn't do much media, and there are times I can recall when I did 3 stand-ups in 3 days. My role was to work constructively and collaboratively with the government for good outcomes. I held the government to account and blocked legislation which I thought was overreach and onerous. Things like the validation of ports, the lifetime ban on refugees, strengthening the character test, the harmonisation of code. And I got the medevac legislation through. It came from me and out of my office. The first time in 90 years the government was defeated on the floor with a substantive bill. I took
just on that, on that medevac
immigration. David, I took immigration out of actually an issue which was front and centre in the campaign, as well as at national conference, where for the first time in a long time, we didn't have a Barney and Blue at national conference. I did the job I was asked to do. I know there are some elements of the media who've criticised me. I think it's precisely the job that was asked of me, and I did it with the full capacity and effectiveness I could muster.
And just on the medevac law, my understanding is the rate of medical transfers from Manus Island and Nauru has actually slowed since the medevac laws came into effect. Do you think they've been a success?
I think the medevac laws provide a number of things. They provide a voice for treating doctors and assessing doctors. They also provide a pathway that avoids costly litigation. We've spent hundreds of thousands of taxpayers' dollars in this country, and the government has done it, fighting cases
fewer
and then
people
giving
are coming.
in.
Fewer asylum seekers are being transferred to Australia.
Well, I haven't got the precise figures right here and now because I'm not the Minister for Home Affairs. But there have been more than a dozen, I understand, of people who've come under the medevac legislation. The government's brought more people outside of that by their own direction and directive than under the medevac legislation. What does that tell you? It tells you that this is a real issue. Making sure that people get the medical care they need and deserve is important.
The medevac system is a lot more cumbersome, a lot more boxes to be ticked and people to check and approve, whereas the prior system was more seamless. The rate of transfer was a lot higher.
David, there's no real system, if I can put it like that, operates like that. What happens is that the government has to fight court case after court case and then gives in and then has people being transferred. This is a very costly process. The medevac legislation is about providing a better pathway to reduce costs and make sure that people who are vulnerable and need medical treatment and assessment can get it. It's a good piece of legislation. It's actually working. It saves the taxpayers a lot of money, and the government should maintain it. It should not overturn it. It's operating successfully now, and the government should not be trying to legislate to abolish it.
Shayne Neumann, thank you for joining us this morning. We look forward to finding out what role you will be in later today. Appreciate that.